Hello, welcome to part 2. I was talking about some of the overlap between communication and psychology. There's a lot of overlap actually when it comes to communication with other disciplines like psychology, sociology, you may have noticed, and if you haven't, you will, anthropology and psychology. So there's a lot of overlap. The difference between psychology and communication, by the way, is psychology is way more focused on the brain. They will tell you all of these ins and outs. And in fact, on campus here at Westminster, the students do a brain lab where they dissect brains and learn about the sectors of the brains and how that impacts us. Communication is focused on how we make meaning, where and why. And the brain absolutely plays a role in that, but we are more about in communication how to build, well, especially in interpersonal communication, how to build a relationship, how to communicate, how we choose to make meaning, and what that and what that means for us. Okay, so that's the difference. I mean, in a nutshell, there's a lot other differences, and there's a reason why communication and psychology are not the same discipline, but that's just the initial difference. Okay, and the reason why I say that is because the organization stage borrows language from psychology, because psychology as the study of the brain, and it's not the only study of the brain. There is neurology and all this other stuff, but psychology is where some of this language comes from, all right, for organization. So after you select, you have to organize, and our brains are amazing organizational tools. It is crazy how well we organize perceptual data. Now, the Brain Games episode, if you watched that, gave you some ways that sometimes our brains fool us, and sometimes we fool our brains. But this idea that we have to take the information and structure it so it makes sense is important. And so your book talks about this idea of punctuation, and I don't know why it's called punctuation. It makes no sense to me, really. Why don't they just call it ordering? or something, I don't know. It seems like there would have been a better word than punctuation. But anyway, punctuation is when you take the information, it comes your way, you select it, and then you structure it into a chronological sequence, okay? That matches how you experience the order of events. Now, your book does a really good job talking about how my punctuation of an event and your punctuation of an event could be very different, because our organization is not unbiased. Our organization is not free from our own self-interest. It's also not free just from our own ignorance in some cases, where I don't know what you experienced on your side. I just know what I experienced, right? And so as innocent as that ignorance may be, I'm not talking about willful ignorance. I'm talking about I don't know what you experienced. And so I've got my version, and hopefully I'm open, which is one of the 5 personality traits, right? Hopefully I'm open to hearing and seeing your perspective. So your book begins with the detailing of the college football game from both sides, and then it gives some examples of a phone going off and your roommate coming into your room and stuff like that. So the idea of punctuation is just that we take the data, we take it, and in the perception process we have to put it in some order. Okay. We have a lot that goes on in organization. You use all sorts of ways to make sense of it, but you just go boom, 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 boom very quickly. So like, for example, in the Brain Games episode where they were talking about the basketball, how do you know what a basketball is? Well, really, someone told you. That goes back to chicken and table, right? But someone told you, but really, you linked the term basketball with the orange ball, and then when you see that basketball, you know it's a basketball because your brain has actually organized it under like round things that are orange with lines. Like, how do you distinguish a basketball from an orange? Well, you have those organizational structures in your brain that do that. Okay, so then you select, you organize, and then you interpret. Okay, so you interpret, which is where you're going to assign the meaning to the selected information. You have to take what you selected, you've put it somewhere, and then it's got that meaning. So we use schemata to do that. Okay, this is how we know that the basketball is different from the orange. Okay, the mental structure that gives me information that defines the concepts, characteristics, and relationships. Okay, that's how I know. That's how I know the difference between the basketball and the orange. Okay, so Within this, we have this idea of attribution. Now, we talked a little bit about attribution way back in week 1 when we said that intent gets attributed onto communicators in an interaction. So here we are with attribution coming into play in an even bigger way. Okay, so attributions are explanations for others' comments or behaviors, or the attaching of meaning to behavior. Really, this is what attribution is attaching meaning to behavior. I see the behavior, I've selected it, I've organized it, and then there's that meaning I have to attach to that, all right? There was the eye roll. I select the eye roll, I organize it under eye rolls, and you know, the eye roll was organized under, they were rolling their eyes at me, they were not watching a plane fly by, right? So we attach that meaning to that behavior. And this is where we get a little more into attribution. There's a lot that goes on here. So first of all, when we make an attribution, you've got two forms of this. And again, your book does a good job talking about this. You've got the internal and external attribution. So internal attributions, so think internally, okay, presumes a person's communication stems from internal causes. So if your partner says something to you that ticks you off, you are going to presume that that's them being mean or whatever is usually the case. Very rarely are we like, oh, you said that because you were in bad traffic for 3 hours on the way home today. You know, very rarely do we actually do the external attribution. The external attribution says that the person's communication is caused by factors unrelated to their personal qualities. So when we're in communication with people, the internal attribution says that they're communicating because that's who they are. They're communicating the way that they are because that's the way that they are. Does that make sense? It sounds pretty simplistic, but that's the internal attribution. The external attribution says they're communicating that way, but it's caused by factors unrelated to their personal qualities. So here in a minute, we're going to talk about how we use different standards for ourselves than we do others when it comes to internal and external attributions. I think I have a sneeze coming on. I'm going to pause. So the sneeze didn't happen. It was one of those awful things where you are sure you're going to sneeze and then it doesn't happen. So we'll see if it sneaks in here in a minute. So we're talking about internal and external attributions. And so the relationship between us attributing meaning and attaching meaning to someone's internal character and who and how they are versus us attributing meaning to there's something else that's causing this. It's got nothing to do with their personal qualities. This relationship leads us to make errors in our attributions. Okay, so this is one of the things that's interesting about when we communicate with people. When we communicate, we are constantly making these attributions, and sometimes it's very conscious, and other times it's not. We have to attach meaning to behavior. It's necessary. We can't not put meaning on behavior. We can learn to pump the brakes, which has to deal with self-monitoring. We can learn to pump the brakes and do a perception check, which is later in the chapter here, but we can't not make attributions. We make them. This is one of the reasons why the book does talk about stereotypes later on. We have to interpret the information that we're getting. We have to interpret the perceptual data that's coming our way, and we're selecting it out, yes, and organizing it, but we have to attribute meaning to it. So the errors that we make are very common. So the three big ones, and there are more actually, but the three big ones are these, and I'm going to start with the fundamental attribution error. It's called the fundamental attribution error because it's fundamental. Okay? This is our tendency to attribute others' behaviors solely to internal causes. Okay? So remember, going back here, the fundamental attribution error says that the behaviors of the person that I am looking at, that I am dealing with, are solely internal. It is the kind of person they are, rather than to the social or environmental forces affecting them. So the fundamental attribution error looks a little bit like this. You go out to eat at a restaurant and the service is not great. And those of you who've worked in food service as someone who serves at tables as a server, you know that this happens because really what happens if the service is not so great? Sometimes it's just because the service is not great, but I find that's pretty rare. Most of the time when I find service is not great, if I look around, I will notice that there's like they're understaffed because 3 people called in or something. And especially in the server world, someone will just not show up like ever again. So all of a sudden, you're supposed to have this. You're supposed to have this many tables, but you have this many tables, and so the service is a little slower. But you've got that customer who's at one of those tables who commits the fundamental attribution error, who says, well, the type of service that I am receiving is because this is the kind of person the server is. They are a bad person, they're a bad server, and when actually the fact that you got service at all means they're probably doing a good job. That's the fundamental attribution error. We do this whenever we're in conflict quite often. We do this whenever we are out and about in our lives. The person who cuts you off in traffic, they did that because they're evil. And they're probably someone who is just a horrible person, right? So the fundamental attribution error is we attribute the behavior solely to internal cause. You cut me off on purpose, and you did it to be a jerk, and you're laughing maniacally in your car because you cut me off. Like we have this tendency to do this. So that's not always the case, right? The actor-observer effect says it's the tendency to make external attributions regarding my own behavior. So I'm gonna attribute things to you because that's the kind of person you are. But I'm gonna attribute things to me because I have to attribute meaning to my own behavior as well. Okay? And this is the external attribution, right? So fundamental attribution error, you do the things you do, and I mean that all of us looking at the other person, saying people do the things they do because that's how they are and that's who they are. But when I do those things, those very same things, well, yes, I cut you off in traffic, but, you know, I had a really bad day at work, and my 3-year-old is screaming at me in the back seat, and I looked, but I guess there was, it was an accident. So you cut me off, you know, you deserve to burn in hell. But if I cut you off, come on, cut me a break, I'm having a rough day, right? So the fundamental attribution error, actor-observer effect, and then the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is our tendency to take credit for success by making the internal attribution. You know, you'll hear some people who are willing to own the fact, oh, wow, that worked out, and that was luck. But we tend to take credit for our success using this idea that, well, you know, I really did well, or I earned it, right? So these ideas of selecting, organizing, and interpreting are fundamental in our communication, because you and I cannot interact back and forth without perception being in place. You and I cannot interact back and forth without making internal and external attributions to each other. And as we go through our lives, these errors that we make are going to, in some cases, define our characters, define our interactions, and we tend to be really frustrated when someone will not give us the benefit of an external attribution. Does that make sense? Where we tend to want that external attribution put on us, but we tend to withhold it from other people when they need it. And so this idea of the ways we make meaning and the ways we choose to make meaning for ourselves and for others is real important. And so here we are at perception, and I'm gonna try to say, hey, as you move forward, you want to try to not do these. You want to try to offer someone the benefit of an external attribution sometimes. I'm not saying all the time. Sometimes people, you know, should have the internal, but we need to realize what we're doing and use it to our advantage to make our lives a little more peaceful, maybe. Okay? I'll see you in part 3.